This is the first intercontinental conference of colored peoples, so-called colored peoples, in the history of mankind.
Welcome to the Third World. My name is Pranay Somayajula. I'm a writer, organizer, and host of Return to Bandung, a podcast that explores questions of imperialism, resistance, and internationalist solidarity throughout history and into the present day. Through historical analysis, interviews with expert guests, and deep dives into classic works of anti-colonial theory, Return to Bandung seeks to make the case for why anti-imperialist politics are as important in our current moment as ever before. Broadcasting to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota, the heartland of the American Empire, this is Return to Bandung. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are in the world, and whatever time of day it is for you, welcome back to Return to Bandung. It's great to have you here. When people on the right and imperialist media outlets and politicians want to fearmonger about why socialism supposedly always fails in practice, they often bring up Venezuela and its ongoing political and economic crisis as proof that socialism can only ever lead to economic disaster, dictatorial tyranny, and a whole host of other ills. Of course, they conveniently leave out the sustained and multifaceted imperialist assault led by the United States that has undermined the socialist project in Venezuela consistently ever since the early 2000s, when Hugo Chavez first came to power and spearheaded the project of socialist construction known as the Bolivarian Revolution, which has continued since 2013 under Chavez's successor, President Nicolás Maduro. Many on the left, unfortunately, especially in the United States, have bought into imperialist narratives that demonize the Bolivarian Revolution and dismiss Venezuela's socialist achievements. And even those few who do rightfully defend Venezuela against imperialist aggression all too often end up placing an overly narrow focus on just the government, while ignoring the much broader dimensions of radical grassroots energy that has always been the heart and soul of the Bolivarian process. And in our current moment, as the United States fascist regime under Donald Trump is ramping up its imperialist aggression against Venezuela to unprecedented levels and amplifying regime change efforts, right now it appears the U.S. is poised to go to war to overthrow the socialist government. It's more crucial than ever that we on the left, here in the United States, in the heart of empire, sharpen our analysis and really understand the nuances of Venezuela's past, present, and future. To discuss the Bolivarian Revolution and the project of socialist construction in Venezuela, and the Chavista grassroots' valiant efforts to defend this revolutionary project against imperialist aggression, I'm joined today by Cira Pascual Marquina and Chris Gilbert, both professors of political science at the Bolivarian University of Venezuela in Caracas. Cira and Chris are longtime collaborators and participants in the Bolivarian Revolutionary Project. They co-host the Marxist political education program Escuela de Cuadros, or Cadre School, and are the co-authors of Venezuela, the Present as Struggle, Voices from the Bolivarian Revolution, published in 2020 by Monthly Review Press. In addition to their many collaborations, Chris is the author of Commune or Nothing, Venezuela's Communal Movement and its Socialist Project, published in 2023 by Monthly Review Press. And Cira is a writer and editor for the really excellent independent news site Venezuela Analysis, which provides perspectives on Venezuela and on the Bolivarian Revolution that you just won't find from CNN or the New York Times or other mainstream corporate media outlets. Now, before we begin today's interview, if you enjoy this episode and you want to support Return to Bandung, please do take a moment to subscribe to the show and leave a review or a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever app you're listening to this on. It only takes a few seconds, and it really does make a difference. Please also take a moment to follow us on social media. We're at Return to Bandung on Instagram and Twitter, and share the show with anyone in your life who might benefit from hearing the revolutionary, anti-imperialist perspective this show hopes to bring. Now, with that housekeeping out of the way, let's get into it. Chris, Cira, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us. It's really great to be here talking with you. It's an important time to be thinking about Venezuela.
Yeah, we're happy to be here.
Definitely. And as I was saying before we started recording it, this interview could not come, I think, at a more important time. And who knows, between now when we're recording this in September and when this comes out in early October, what will have happened. And I'm just so grateful to you both for coming on here to share this important perspective and challenge imperialist narratives at a moment like this. We have a lot of ground to cover, and we'll talk about the current situation between the U.S. and Venezuela in the course of this conversation. But before we get started, would you mind both telling the listeners a little bit about yourselves, your background, and your work? And maybe, Cira, if you want to answer the question first, then I can pass it over to Chris.
Yes, I'm Cira. I'm a popular educator at the Pluriversidad, which is the educational initiative of El Panal commune here in Caracas, in the working class barrio of 23 de Enero. I'm also part of the International Communal Democracy Network, and I'm a researcher and writer with Chris Gilbert, who's here with us too. We've written together Venezuela, the Present as a Struggle, that was published in 2020 by Monthly Review. And we are also the authors of a testimonial series of books published in Venezuela with Anti-Blockade Observatory, which is called Communal Resistance to the Imperialist Blockade.
So I'm Chris Gilbert. I'm professor of political studies at the Bolivarian University. Together with Cira, we've produced this television program called Escuela de Cuadros, Cadre School, which was aired in Venezuela National Television and now is a podcast. It's available on YouTube and other places. I've written a book called Commune or Nothing that deals with Venezuelan communes, looking at them in the period, especially from 2019 to the present. And most recently, Cira and I together have co-guest edited an issue of Monthly Review, the summer issue of Monthly Review, on the communes and socialist construction. I'd like to point out that we came here approximately 20 years ago with a very simple, but I believe very legitimate motive of simply learning from the Bolivarian Revolution. And I'd say that we're also formed as militants, formed as revolutionaries, formed as Marxists by the Bolivarian Revolution.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for that introduction. And Chris, I think this next question, maybe I'll toss over to you first, since you just spoke to your experience, how your own political development has really been shaped by having witnessed the Bolivarian Revolution firsthand. And so it might be good to sort of set the stage for this conversation for a lot of my listeners, especially those who are based in the US or elsewhere in the global north and don't really have a full understanding of what the Bolivarian Revolution is, to give sort of a brief overview of the history and the development of socialist construction in Venezuela. And I know this is a huge question to open up with, but just sort of the bird's eye view for listeners who might not be familiar. What do we mean when we talk about Chavismo? What do we mean when we talk about the Bolivarian Revolution? What has this process of the revolution been, and what have its successes and achievements and challenges been over the years, and where do things currently stand?
You're right, that's a huge question. I will attempt to treat it as briefly as possible, respecting important content. I think one shouldn't talk about the Bolivarian Revolution without mentioning Bolivar. After all, that's where the name comes from. And I actually find it extraordinary that quite often people outside of Venezuela do not pay attention to Bolivar. People who had a chance to listen to Hugo Chavez, the great leader and former president of Venezuela, he never ceased talking about Simon Bolivar. Everything that he inaugurated was called Simon Bolivar, whether it was a satellite or an avenue or a monument. And so obviously to fail to mention Simon Bolivar would be a grave error. So I guess I want to begin 200 years ago, roughly, though technically, of course, the class struggle, the anti-colonial struggle here goes back something like 500 years. So Simon Bolivar was one of the key figures in the independence of Latin America 200 years ago. And I think the most important thing about Venezuelan, independence struggles as it was led from Venezuela, was that there was actually a social revolution that took place here, an incomplete social revolution. Perhaps, and the only comparable social revolution in the continent would be Haiti. And the project that emerged over time here was very ambitious and involved social changes that involved anti-colonialism, and it involves continental integration, the notion of the Patria Grande, which would bring the Latin American continent together, to confront what wasn't quite imperialism there, but to confront the North, to confront colonial powers. And that project was not completed. Bolivar died saying that he had plowed in the ocean, that he'd been unsuccessful in carrying out his major goals. And this, you could say that Venezuelan history for the next 200 years up to the present has been the continual struggle to revive that project, or a continual class struggle that was unleashed by that contradiction, the incompleteness of the revolution. In the 19th century, an impressive thing was were the federal wars, which were essentially small campesinos, small peasant producers fighting against the oligarchy in an unsuccessful attempt to carry out land reform. And in the 20th century, there were important struggles against the dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gomez. In the 60s, the Venezuelan guerrilla fighting against a extremely limited pro-imperialist democracy also was notable. Jean-Paul Sartre said if he'd accepted the Nobel Prize, he would have given the money to the Venezuelan guerrilla. So coming up to the present, to the actual Bolivarian Revolution of the 21st century, I think most people began to talk about its proximate roots as the 1989 Caracazo, when there was an attempt to implement neoliberalism in Venezuela through a kind of neoliberal package. And that led to a wide uprising in Caracas and other cities of Venezuela, and it was severely repressed. And that led 3 years later in 1992 to a military uprising that was led by Hugo Chavez. The military, we call it Cuatro F, 4th of February, and it was unsuccessful too, but it positioned Chavez and his project. He'd been conspiring in the military since the 1970s. It positioned him in the popular consciousness and the media. He was in prison for 2 years. He came out of prison and began a campaign that led him around the country and eventually turned into an electoral campaign. And he and the movement, which was called the Fifth Republic movement, won the elections in 1998. And Chavez was sworn in as president in 1999. Chavez was not a socialist, or was not a declared socialist when he assumed power. You could say that he believed in popular participation. He could say that he was a visceral, de facto anti-imperialist, that he believed in popular sovereignty, which I think would be one of the key ideas. But as the 20th century unfolds, and for example, he meets resistance in an attempt to do land reform, he meets resistance in an attempt to nationalize the oil resource, and finally the coup d'etat is carried out in 2002, a coup d'etat that lasts about 24 hours. This ends up radicalizing the process. He declares the process to be anti-imperialist in 2004 and socialist in 2006. When we were actually here when that happened, it was a remarkable thing because it was in the lead up to the elections of 2006. And I've always admired Chavez for the boldness of his programs. Most people, when they approach elections, they curtail their programs. And Chavez declared that people who voted for him would be voting for socialism. And then the socialist project, there were various attempts to build socialist economies through cooperatives, through co-managed factories, state-owned factories sometimes. And then in 2009, the commune emerges. Chavez declares that we will build socialism using the commune as a basic cell. And then there's a set of laws that come out in 2010. So Chavez dies in 2013, and Nicolas Maduro is elected as successor. And then we have the 12 years that lead up to the present. I should point out that many people attempt to draw a line between Hugo Chavez and Maduro, and I find that extremely insidious. At present, you can see that Maduro has earned his revolutionary stripes, you could say, by holding the unity of Chavismo, by enduring extreme imperialist aggressions, and then, in a very impressive way, after enduring the worst of the crisis, the worst of the storm, turning once again to the popular movement, giving once again state support to the communes. And that's kind of where we are in the present. In a great measure, in spite of the imperialist aggressions that are happening right now, we're in an auspicious moment for socialist construction. There was a huge grassroots movement, revival of the communes approximately 8 years ago that happened in the very worst of the crisis. And then this kind of synthesis or symbiotic relationship being restored or being accentuated in the past 3 years points to a very auspicious moment for socialist construction in Venezuela.
I really appreciate that overview. Again, I know I gave you a difficult task by summarizing so much history so quickly, but something I've always been really fascinated by since I began learning about the Bolivarian process has been the sort of the radicalization of the process over time. As you said, it wasn't declared as a socialist project until 2006, although things were moving in that direction sooner, and that's often not the direction that you see. You see governments come into power very radically and then tack to the right, tack to the center as they face opposition. And it's very inspiring to see Chavez set an example that you can successfully do the opposite of that. Chris, in your answer, you sort of pointed towards this. So maybe, Cyril, I'd invite you to expand on the response we've seen to the Bolivarian Revolution from Western imperialism, particularly from the United States. Ever since 1999, when Chavez first came to power, there have been relentless attacks by the U.S., which sees a socialist Venezuela in its backyard as a threat to be dealt with, much like it sees socialist Cuba. And these attacks have really been relentless over the years, especially during the first and second Trump administrations. The U.S. has subjected Venezuela to punishing sanctions and other coercive measures. They claim it's about fighting corruption, targeting specific officials or whatever, but really this is about affecting regime change and undermining and rolling back the progress and the successes of the Bolivarian Revolution. So, Cira, could you share an overview of what the imperialist response to Venezuela's socialist project has looked like and how it's evolved over time prior to the current escalation we're seeing now, which we'll get to shortly, both in terms of sanctions and other efforts, but also what the impact has been on the socialist project writ large, but also on the everyday lives of ordinary Venezuelans?
So, of course, as Chris was pointing out, the first evidence of the imperialist intent of overthrowing the Venezuelan revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution, is 2002 with the coup against Chavez. And that actually there was direct participation of the US through the US Embassy in Caracas. It's well documented. This was triggered precisely because there had been both the land law, which gave the right to peasants without land to take land that was not being worked on, and also because of the law that actually gave full claim of its oil to the Venezuelan state and to the Venezuelan people. But then during Chavez, there were many, many aggressions. Of course, there were mercenary incursions. There were all sorts of attacks. It is true, however, that when Chavez died, there is an escalation of imperialist aggression against the Bolivarian Revolution. I mean, possibly, of course, it was a very difficult time for the Bolivarian Revolution to have lost Chavez, who was a tremendously charismatic leader, but also an intellectual, but also an educator, a really extraordinary leader overall. So when Chavez dies, the situation internally is difficult because it was too early, etc. We will not go into it. In 2015, Obama declares Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat, a country in the global south with a relatively small army that is there only to protect the sovereignty of the nation, of the country, was declared an unusual and extraordinary threat. And that's when things begin to get really, really difficult. Smaller kind of like targeted sanctions begin then, but those smaller targeted sanctions actually had an impact because many of those smaller in quotes, I will put it, smaller targeted sanctions were going against people in the government. So that meant that basically international corporations could not do business with the Venezuelan government. So beginning 2015, 2016, those are very, very difficult years. And then in 2017, the more all-out financial sanctions begin. The 2017 financial sanctions, 2019, the oil blockade, secondary sanctions, and a constant escalation with both administrations, Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, have been all out against Venezuela since the beginning of the Bolivarian process, but specifically since 2015. So what is the impact on an oil-producing country that had more than 95% of its income coming from the sales of oil? What happens to a country in these circumstances when, for instance, oil cannot be sold, traded, because of primary and secondary sanctions? Later, we can talk a little bit about secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions basically mean that, say, a Spanish company cannot buy oil from Venezuela and expect to go on doing businesses with the United States. Obviously, the United States is pretty important economically still. So secondary sanctions mean that For instance, oil production went from roughly 3 million barrels per day to around 300,000 barrels per day. The impact was drastic on the economy. The hardest years were, we could say, well, 2016, 2017 were very hard years because there actually wasn't enough food to go around and there wasn't enough medicine to go around. But then around 2018, 19, the situation gets really, really, really difficult. I mean, no access to medicines, wages go down dramatically. And actually, in terms of numbers, there's data that points to around 40,000 people dying between 2018, 2017, 18, and 19. So basically, we are talking about a war without visible weapons, but all in all, a war, and a war which the United States government generally acknowledges that is a war to overthrow the Venezuelan government, right? They actually acknowledge that their intent is regime change. So, what has happened with the people, though? Of course, people have suffered a lot, but the people of Venezuela keep resisting, keep building communes. And as Chris was kind of pointing out earlier, Chavez begins to talk about the communes in 2009, but it is actually in the worst of times, around 2016, 2017, 2018, really very difficult. Everybody was very skinny, like all of a sudden, every grandma and every grandfather was dying. But it was around that time when people began to remember that comuna o nada, commune or nothing, that Chavez said in his famous speech, Strike at the Helm. So in the time when there was actually nada, if you went to the store, there was nothing in the store. People remember the commune. This is actually very extraordinary. It happened spontaneously, of course, spontaneously to the degree that in different places around the country, people began to turn back to the commune. Because actually, one thing that I should highlight is that in 2009, 2010, 2011, it was a time of peak commodities. So the state, the Venezuelan state, with the revolutionary government inhabiting it, was able to give a rather efficient responses to the needs of the people. So there wasn't an urgency. People liked the idea of making communes around that time. Many communes were formally made, and some of them began to have a communal life. But actually, it wasn't until the very worst time when people, which is, as I was saying, 2016, 17, 18, where there was kind of like a mass turn towards the commune. So these have been very, very difficult times. They have been extremely, extremely painful, but also beautiful times because the people have turned and people are in the worst of conditions building a socialist alternative. It's extraordinary.
I'm so glad you spoke to the ways that people responded and resisted against this, because it's so easy to paint a narrative of just victimization and attacks and assaults from imperialism. But wherever there is imperialism in the global south, there is resistance, and there always has been. And Venezuela has really shown that. And one narrative that you just want to really highlight for listeners, a narrative that you sometimes hear in response to talking about sanctions is that people who are supporters of regime change will say, oh, well, Venezuela's crisis actually started when oil prices crashed. It had nothing to do with sanctions. But there's been research done that shows that, yes, there was an oil price crash in 2014 that negatively affected every oil exporting country, including Venezuela, was hit especially hard. But every other oil exporting country in the world, including Venezuela's neighbor, Colombia, saw a decline in its oil production at the same time. One of the only countries, however, that wasn't able to recover from that, the oil production didn't recover after oil prices rebounded, was Venezuela. And that lines up exactly with the sanctions being imposed in 2017. And so it just completely shatters this narrative that, in fact, the sanctions have nothing to do with it, and Venezuela's crisis is due to economic mismanagement or whatever, you hear when you turn on CNN or open the New York Times. This is just completely a bogus narrative. I just wanted to throw that in there. Chris, did you have anything you wanted to add to what Cira had to say?
No, I think that was very thorough.
Great. Well, in that case, then actually, I'll turn it to you to sort of bring us right now into the present moment. Again, I've alluded to, we're having this conversation at a moment of really dangerous situation where the U.S. is ramping up its imperialist aggression against Venezuela, against the Bolivarian Revolution, really more severely than we've ever seen before. I mean, just in recent weeks, we've seen escalations on numerous fronts. On August 7th, about a month ago, the Trump administration announced a $50 million bounty against President Maduro on these really bogus accusations that he's one of the quote largest narco traffickers in the world, even though the former head of the UN Drug Policy Council has said this is a completely made up narrative. And yet this is what the US is claiming to justify it. And now we're seeing that the US appears to be gearing up for a full-scale military invasion and regime change effort in Venezuela. The Pentagon has moved warships carrying thousands of troops to the waters off Venezuela's coast. They struck a boat, killing 11 people, and they're claiming that this was a drug boat, but haven't provided evidence to this effect at all. And now Trump is, using this increasingly belligerent rhetoric, talking about shooting down Venezuelan jets that fly too close to American ships and so on. There's reports the administration is considering strikes within the country on alleged drug cartels. So I was wondering, Chris, if you could speak to sort of what you make of these developments and also what the reaction inside Venezuela has been, both from the government, but more importantly, from the people, from the grassroots. How are people responding to this? And then what do you think of the current level of threat to Venezuela's sovereignty, to the Bolivarian Revolution?
Sure, I think you did a very thorough summary. I should point out we're speaking on September 11th, 2025, because who knows what will happen tomorrow. It's right. It's absolutely right. There's approximately been a 1 month extreme escalation in the past month. It was about a month ago that they put the 50 million bounty on Maduro's head with a kind of echo of the way the U.S. carried out its indigenous genocide in North America. And Nick Estes pointed out that recently, the remarkable coincidence between these tactics they're employing. And then rapidly, there was a deployment of ships and aircraft into the Caribbean with lots of saber rattling accompanying them. And then recently, they blew up a fast boat. They sent some kind of missile and blew up a fast boat carrying 11 people in an extreme violation of international law, in a situation where they could well easily stopped it and interrogated the people on it, but they did this spectacular explosion. So I think people are right to be concerned, is precisely from what Cira said. You should point. It's also clear that imperialist aggression is nothing new here. We've been living it in a certain sense from the very beginning for over the past 25 years. And as far as the level of threat, I think that the precise level one cannot know. I think obviously anyone who observes Donald Trump will know that one of his main characteristics is being extremely erratic. And it's not erratic because he's crazy. I think it's precisely a form of how do you essentially do dictatorial rule in the conditions of a formal democracy. Part of that is not showing your hand ever. Part of that is keeping people in an extreme state of uncertainty. Just in a simple democratic principle, you can see how both Chavez and Maduro are always explaining to people in long discourses, which some people find tiresome, but long expletive discourses precisely what they're thinking. And if you know what the leader of your country or the elected leader of your country is thinking, then you have a chance to debate it, push back against it, participate in that decision making.
I'll just say conveniently that the US media never bothers to translate those discourses into English. So what we get told here in the US is, oh, these are erratic dictators that are governing by whim, even though they're explaining exactly what they're doing to their people and winning the support of their people. But we don't see that again if you turn on CNN here in the US.
Sure, I would say that Chavez initiated a new form of leadership in the sense that there could be no secrets, because how can you speak for 5 hours and maintain a secret? In other words, everyone was completely clear about where he wanted to go, and that provided transparency and I believe a high index of democracy at the same time. So while I would say there's been an ongoing threat and there appears to be an escalation of a threat in recent times, I think that what you can do in terms of trying to make it more precise is to look at what the motives might be. And for a long time, people have been saying that the United States will try to tighten control of its patio trasero, tighten control of its backyard, its so-called backyard. And I've heard this over the past 20 years or so. Nevertheless, I think there might be a good reason to believe the United States will try to do it now, in part because obviously their inability to defeat China, their inability to reduce Russia through sanctions and outright aggressions, in great measure through nuclear aggressions, their deployments through Europe. They have not been able to subordinate Russia, to drive it back into the neoliberal regime they'd like to implement there. So that gives a good reason, an immediate reason for the United States to try to tighten up and take control of its so-called backyard. And it's true that also different political things that have happened, particularly the rise of right-wing figures like Milei, the weakening of the pink tide movement, have provided perhaps a politically opportune moment for them to attempt to do that. So those are reasons for concern. I should point out that the drug claims are completely bogus. Even the UN has said that Venezuela is not, no one believes that Venezuela is a drug producer. Now, the claim is that it's a country where drugs is a country of transit, but the UN denies that, and even the DEA denies that. I believe that the UN believes that approximately 8% of the drugs that go to the United States come from Venezuela, but the huge majority passes through the Pacific corridor. And I don't see the United States blowing up. I don't want them to, but I don't see the United States acting with that aggression on the Pacific corridor. Now, the other thing with regard to these fantasies they develop, like the factory of fantasies by which they develop the Cartel de los Soles and the Tren de Aragua, it's hard to know it's like, how do you prove the non-existence of a unicorn? I mean, it's a difficult task because you could say that it's biologically impossible or that there's been no evidence. And both those things, no one's ever offered any proof of the existence of the Cartel de los Soles. And apart from that, it seems to be a kind of plagiarized fantasy because in the 1990s, there was a book written about Venezuelan generals collaborating with US drug traffickers. And this is the 1990s, well before Chavez arrived to power, well before the Bolivarian process. And so one interesting piece of lore that perhaps not everybody knows is that the sign for a general in Venezuela is a sun, a sol. That's where the Cartel de los Soles appears. Now, the very people that have been from the beginning accused of belonging to the Cartel de los Soles are low-ranking officers. Diosdado Cabello is merely a captain. So they've kind of got the story wrong and very improbable from the beginning. Apart from that, one important thing to think about is like, what is the motive for drug trafficking in a given country? Venezuela's got a huge amount of resources from oil. Oil is the big business here. And if you're interested in making money, trafficking oil is a much more important business. So I think the story is highly improbable and ridiculous from the beginning.
Thanks so much, Chris. And again, I'm just like truly our solidarity completely and unequivocally with the people of Venezuela right now. And I think to anyone in the US who is listening, like we have exactly one responsibility, and that's not to sit here and criticize and wax poetic about what we would do differently if we were in charge of this country or that country. It is to oppose the blockade, it is to oppose the sanctions, to oppose the military aggression, and to defend to the hilt Venezuela's right to sovereignty and self-determination, because that's under attack right now. Although, as you said rightfully, Chris, it has been under attack since day one. And so that is our responsibility as anti-imperialists here in the Imperial Core. Cira, I want to pass it over to you now, but then, of course, Chris, feel free to jump in to add to this. But to talk about your academic and journalistic work, which is very interconnected on Venezuela's revolution. I first got the idea to invite you both on the show after reading the book that you co-edited back in 2020, Venezuela, The Present is Struggle, which came out from Monthly Review Press, and also to listening to various interviews that you both have done on a number of other podcasts. The book, The Present is Struggle, is structured as a series of interviews conducted with grassroots Chavista activists, everyone from commune leaders to trade unionists to people organizing the urban poor and building food sovereignty networks. And since 2020, when that book came out, you've also continued to publish interviews with people who are actively participating in the Bolivarian process, in the process of grassroots socialist construction. And there's a great series you've been putting out to that effect on the Venezuela Analysis website. I'll link some of those interviews in the show notes for listeners to check out. They're really an incredible resource. And I was wondering, Cira, if you could speak a little bit to why in your work as a scholar, as a journalist, you have placed such an important emphasis on documenting and sharing the perspective of ordinary people who are engaged in the Chavista movement, everyday people, sort of foot soldiers of the revolution, as opposed to high-level movement leaders or bureaucrats or government representatives. What do you think are some of the insights or perspectives that people at the grassroots have to offer that might be missing from a more sort of top-down narrative, which is something that we often get here in the West? And also, if you could speak to some of the challenges that you've faced in the work of getting these stories, interviewing these people, centering their perspectives.
Well, indeed, our lines of work is testimonial work, basically going being with the people who are building communes or who are feminist organization and so on, and listening to them. So we've basically done hundreds and hundreds of interviews over the past 10 years or so. There is a long practice in the Latin American left of testimonial work, to be as part of the people, to be with the people, listen to the people, because after all, I think we probably all agree that the revolution is done by the people, with its leadership, of course, but by the people. Without the people, you cannot do a revolution. So it's as simple as that. We began doing interviews and testimonial work with folks around 2016, 2017, 2018. And that was a very hard time, as we talked before. Actually, the imperialist blockade against the people of Venezuela has had very, very profound effects on the daily life of people. And at that time, basically, the government had to, because of the pressures because of the blockade, had to make some concessions, had to push for some liberalizations. However, these liberalizations, for instance, of the prices and of the exchange rates, some of the liberalizations were not particularly favored by the grassroots for obvious reasons, right? So it was a rather complex time in which the government had to make certain concessions in a country that was still and is still capitalist. The concessions that were made, let's say, to survive the blockade, were capitalist concessions. This generated a period where the government and the popular movement, and especially the grassroots communal movement, were not perfectly in tune with each other. Of course, there was never any question within the grassroots movement to make a rupture with the government or anything like that, but there was a time where the affinities were not so intense. But the story, as is told by the interviews and the work that we have been doing, is very interesting. Of course, in any revolution, in any revolutionary process, there's moments of advances and moments when you walk back. And the Bolivarian Revolution is no exception to that. Now, the most extraordinary thing is that in the more recent years, as Chris was saying, maybe beginning 3 or 4 years ago, there has been a very important turn of the government towards the communal movement. Now, I think I want to take a couple of minutes here to explain what is a commune, because communes are really the roadmap for socialism in Venezuela, I would say, in a few words, right? So one might think about a hippie commune, or may think about the Chinese communes, or one might think about the Commune of Paris, the Paris Commune. So what do we actually mean when we talk about commune? So Chavez begins to talk about socialism in 2006. In 2009, he proposes the communes. Of course, to build a socialist society, you need to have a pathway. You have to understand it's not enough to say that you're going to do it. You have to have a plan. You have to have a pathway. And that's where the commune comes into play. The commune basically is a territorial space, say a barrio or a campo, in the country, several communal councils being grassroots direct democracy spaces that were built in Venezuela around 2006. So around 2009, there's the proposal of the communes. Several communal councils will come to be a commune. Now, what's the difference between a communal council, which is a direct democracy space where in the assembly the people decide what their problems are and how they're going to go about solving them, and the commune? Well, the commune should not be interpreted exclusively as the sum of several communal councils, but the commune is the roadmap for socialism, precisely because the communes are the spaces where social relations will be transformed, including social relations of production. So communes, we could say that they walk over two legs. One of them is direct democracy, grassroots democracy, substantive democracy. But when you talk about substantive democracy, you cannot have a substantive democracy in a capitalist society. So when you talk about substantive democracy, you also have to talk about the economy. So Venezuelan communes should have means of production, and the means of production are means of production under the property form which we call social property. In other words, a communal means of production. For instance, in my commune, in El Panal commune, there's a factory to make garments. The property of that factory is the communes. It's not the workers, which would be as in a co-op. It is not the state. It is, of course, not private either. It is the whole community. So the surplus goes actually to the community, and it goes to the community via assemblies, the community deciding what to do with that surplus. So the communes are profoundly democratic spaces for the reorganization of society, economically, socially, culturally, etc., etc. So after that parenthesis about what a commune is, I'll go back to the testimonial work that we have been doing. The most important testimonial work that we have been doing since 2021 is this series, which also appears in Venezuela Analysis, which is communal resistance. Communal resistance is a project that we do hand in hand with the Venezuelan Anti-Blockade Observatory, where we do stays in communes, and we interview dozens of communards to understand what they are doing. Why is this important? Why is it important that a communard in Yaracuy in some rural area, or a communard in Barcelona, here in Venezuela, in some urban area near an oil rig? Why is it important to listen to them? Well, actually, it's extremely important because they are the ones who are building an alternative. Of course, building an alternative has to be understood as a national project, but it is actually the people on the ground, the ones who are building these new social relations. And this is extremely important. So I think that indeed, the mass media, when they talk about Venezuela, they will not talk about the suffering of the Venezuelan people on the one hand, and on the other hand, the left often will just focus on the government, which has to be supported. This is a government that is the government of the Venezuelan people and has to be supported by any internationalist, any person who loves peace and respects and is for the respect of sovereignty. But it is important too to know what the people are doing, and what is happening here. It is truly extraordinary. In communes, you can actually see, in the worst of times, you can already see new social relations emerging. Are communes heaven? No, there's many problems. One, because there's problems imposed from outside. Two, because it's a difficult thing to build a socialist society, and because internal contradictions, even within a barrio, what have you, there will always be contradictions. But the truth is that you can see a new world beginning to emerge, a new world beginning to sprout when you look at communes. So I can say that we feel extremely lucky, privileged, and also proud, I would say, actually, to have been doing this work, to be doing this work that actually documents this transformation of society that is happening from the ground up, but of course also we support from the Bolivarian government, especially in the last few years.
Thank you so much, Cira. That was really great. And I just, cannot stress enough how important the work that you are doing, this testimonial work, really is to getting these stories out there, especially to those of us in the imperial core who just simply will not hear them otherwise. And I think your answer, especially in what you were saying about communes, really, it touched on a lot of the things that I wanted to talk about in the last few questions I have for you both. So I appreciate you sort of laying the groundwork for that. Chris, if you have anything that you'd like to add to what Cira had to say.
Yeah. One thing I would like to do is turn the question around. Like, why don't people do testimonial work? Why don't they listen to the grassroots anymore? And as Cira pointed out, it's not because we don't believe in the direction. It's not because we don't believe in top-down power. We absolutely do. In fact, our understanding of the Bolivarian process is that essentially one of its major contributions, especially in the Latin American context, is that the 1990s was kind of dominated by what we call movimentismo, a kind of emphasis on social movements, turning one's back on state power. And Chavez, certainly in the Bolivarian process in general, the Venezuelan people opened a new chapter by simply taking power. A book that was published about the Bolivarian Revolution was How to Change the World by Taking Power, recovering the Leninist idea that state power is the essential thing in a revolution. But at the same time, Lenin, Mao, they were always clear the importance of popular power of the two levels. So the question becomes, why don't people pay attention to the bases any longer? Why doesn't testimonial literature exist any longer? And I think that's a good question. I don't have all the answers. One thing I would point to is the domination of academia. You can't make money, or you probably can't get tenure if you're doing testimonial literature. So that's one reason it turns away from it. But I would say that also it's just a widespread phenomenon. There's kind of a glass wall that's erected between the middle class and the masses in a way that's unprecedented in history, growing. I think it's a secular gradual movement. And you could point to the social networks as having a role in that. It used to be that priests, radical priests thought they had to go to the masses, and there are great examples of that in Latin America. Or the intellectuals from the universities thought they had to go to the factories. And now I don't see that belief existing. And I think testimonial literature and the great history of popular power, whether it's in the Soviet Revolution or whether it's in the Chinese Revolution, much of that is getting somehow steamrolled or forgotten precisely because of this. People have forgotten the other half of the story. And the other thing that's interesting is that people think that the two things are opposed to each other. It's like some compromise. Some state power and popular power are two substances, and each one encounters the other, and it's a zero-sum game. But in fact, it's not that way, because as the Bolivarian process proves, precisely by taking power, there was a huge wave of popular participation of a kind unprecedented in these experiments, like the Zapatista one, which were carried out under a more anarchist and autonomous ideology. So that I think that the real story of popular power is that it has to go hand in hand with the opening that are provided by a revolutionary government.
Great, thank you so much. And again, that I think also really segues very nicely into the next question that I wanted to ask. And maybe I'll just throw this out there, and whichever of you wants to jump in first. This question about, I'm very interested in the context of the Bolivarian Revolution, this sort of dialectic that exists between the grassroots and the state, between the movement and the state. Because here in the US, and I think, Cira, you alluded to this in your earlier answers, so much of the discourse about Venezuela, both on the imperialist side, but also on our side, the anti-imperialist side, focuses overwhelmingly on the state, especially these days, since 2013, specifically focuses on the individual figure of Nicolas Maduro as a political leader. On the one hand, you have American ruling class, elites, and imperialist media that'll demonize Venezuela's government as the root of all evil and demonize Maduro himself. And then many, even on the so-called American left, parrots those same talking points. They'll say, oh, he's a dictator, he's authoritarian, he's this, he's that. But then on the other hand, even anti-imperialist leftists, the handful of us that exist, often fall into the same trap in another way by sort of equating solidarity with Venezuela or solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution solely with uncritical support of the government and not really ever addressing the grassroots element that is the basis of the revolution. And reading your work, taking in these perspectives from on-the-ground participants, and of course, just this conversation that we're having here today, I've been really struck by the nuance with which many people, both you both and also the individuals that you interview, talk about the state, this really nuanced perspective where, many articulate criticisms of the current government for various reasons, but then these critiques are always balanced with a very, very clear and principled understanding that you cannot have any compromise at all on the need to defend this government to the hilt against all forms of aggression, imperialism, regime change efforts. And I think coming from an American left perspective, where again, we really get trapped in these unproductive black and white cycles of thinking, I find this to be a much more nuanced and refreshing analysis from grassroots Chavista activists. And this analysis clearly being rooted in the principles of Marxism, of dialectical materialism. So again, whichever of you wants to jump in first, if you could speak a little bit more to how this dialectic plays out in the Venezuelan context, specifically both how the government has conceptualized that dialectic, how the grassroots Chavistas have as well, and the role of popular power in the Bolivarian Revolution.
So I'll go first. I think that going back to this timeline that we were talking about of the last few years, how there was a time when Indeed, because of the external pressures, the government had to make some concessions, but those concessions generated some frictions with the grassroots movement. I think that the best way to explain this dialectic that actually exists is that during that time, as I was saying before, no actually existing organization that had any work with the people actually thought for a second about making a rupture with the government. Everybody always truly supported the Bolivarian government, but there were criticisms. And I think that the best way to understand this dialectic is that the government over the past few years has actually really turned towards the communes very strongly. It has done a very strong turn. So if you listen to President Maduro say 7 years ago, it's unlikely that you would hear him talk about a commune. If you hear him right now, I think there's probably no speech of President Nicolas Maduro where he doesn't mention the communes. So that is an extraordinary turn. And the turn is not only by the president, but it's by the government as a whole. So basically, I would say that the moral reserve of the Bolivarian process is within the communes, and the government identifies this correctly. There was a level of criticism to certain policies from the grassroots, and indeed the government listened to this criticism and it turned fully towards the communes. So it is impossible to understand today the Bolivarian government. Of course, the Bolivarian Revolution at any time would be impossible to be understood. Since Chavez begins to talk about the communes, you couldn't understand the Bolivarian process without the communes. But you couldn't understand the Bolivarian government right now if you didn't understand the communes. It is indeed sad to me that the anti-imperialist left that supports the Bolivarian process does not center the defense of the Bolivarian Revolution more on the communes, while fully supporting, as it well should, the Bolivarian government. There is a little bit of a change. I think we have seen a little bit of a change. Also, maybe as the government has been doing its own correction, we can maybe over the last year or so, when internationalists come to Venezuela, because I'm part of the commune in Caracas in 23 de enero, well, many of them want to come to visit the commune, to learn about the commune, and so on. So we have seen a little bit of a shift, but it is still not enough. And really supporting fully the Venezuelan government does not, there's enough room to do both things, and both things have to be done. It would be absurd to think that you have to do one and not the other. Putting the spotlight on the communes, I think it has the virtue of bringing over to our side people who might not be so interested in the government itself. I mean, who may have been penetrated by the ideology imposed by the mainstream media and by the imperialist machine. And so when people begin to see that people here in Venezuela, that when people abroad begin to see that people here in Venezuela, that communards are building, who are people like themselves, like working class people with many problems, of course, many more problems than other people in the global north, but still not that people in the global north don't have problems. But when people begin to see that there is a substantive democracy happening in the communes, I think that is also a better way to win people over to be solidarious with the communes and with the Bolivarian process, and to support the government and to be against the constant imperialistic aggression against the people of Venezuela. So I think that in that dialectic between the government and the grassroots, going back to it, and popular power, I imagine that there's no revolution where there aren't moments of more, where they come closer together, and moments with perhaps more tensions. I think that what we have to center right now is with things like the popular consultations that are happening every 3 months, which are spaces of direct democracy, but with support from the government, where the government, which each commune and future commune territory organizes in assemblies to define what are their priorities. Then they go to a vote. We go to a vote, which is which one of the projects that have been debated in an assembly will be funded. Immediately after that happens, the government, I I swear, like the day after, 2 days after, delivers the money to the communes, to the communal bank, and then the commune itself manages the doing of the project. Which in Panal right now we have a project which is like a project to fix streets, another project to make an open air gym. All those kinds of projects are self-managed. But the interesting thing about these councils is not only that they help solve problems that people can identify better than somebody from outside, which is pretty obvious, right? Like who knows better their problems than the people in the community, but it also puts pressure, or pressure in the good sense, pressure on communes that don't have such robust assembly processes to do their assemblies, because you have to go to an assembly-based process to get this funding from the government. So the government has been turning towards the communes, but it also has been developing very effective processes to activate communes that are not so active. Formally, there's more than 4,000 communes in Venezuela. Formally, there's more than 4,000. But the truth is that many of those communes are incipient communes. And these kind of initiatives from the government, like the council, actually is making these incipient communes become more complete communes. And that's really wonderful. So that's what I would say about the dialectic between the government and the popular movement, which expresses itself best in the communes here in Venezuela.
That was very powerfully said, and I think you really captured the nuances of that dialectic really well. Thank you so much. Chris, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I could offer a kind of credo saying that I believe the state is an instrument of class rule, that it has, under capitalism, state has an important role in protecting private property, in organizing the different factions of the bourgeoisie to have a political direction, and even to a certain extent, mitigating a class struggle. And all those things I think are true. But I think more useful would be to say that, and I hope this isn't just an intellectual escape, but I believe that actually to some degree all of our work is an attempt to chart that relation. Like when you think about what the present struggle is, I think that it's a great measure talking to the basis. So some people were relatively non-organic intellectuals among those we interviewed, and even people with important connections to state power. But I would say that the one explanation of what we're doing is something like the mass line. The Maoist idea of the mass line is you go to the masses. Some people say that Chairman Mao invented the focus group. You get 20 people together and you discuss what what you try to distill what the masses want. To a certain extent, I believe that we were doing that, and that provides a kind of that is one example of the relationship between the masses and the state, or the masses and the direction, a kind of conveyor belt in an attempt to remain in contact with the bases. And then I think more recently, I've been interested in this question of how the communes serve as another articulation or point of connection between the grassroots and the state. Like you could say, or the grassroots and the revolutionary direction. Some people would say the commune is simply an instance of popular power, but I'm actually interested in the notion of that the commune is in some ways is a kind of point which connects grassroots with the state power. And I see that as one of the enigmas, one of the challenges that process of national liberation, which is what this is, process of national liberation and socialist construction, have faced over time. You could say that when you look at the 20th century, you can see how process of national liberation often failed to solve that enigma because they would lose mass participation and therefore become weak. So I think the Bolivarian process, and I always emphasize that the Bolivarian process, like any revolutionary process, aspires to, or there's elements in it that have universal importance that at least could be evaluated as universal contributions to socialism. So I think many of the Bolivarian process experiments attempts to keep the dialogue, keep channels of communication with the masses open, keep alive popular participation in a process that necessarily has an important on a strategic direction from above. I think these are among its most important contributions. And right now the commune is at the center of that. In a schematic way, I would say there's like two conceptions of communes. When people think about communes, because it fits with middle-class ideas, autonomous anarchist theory is the dominant way of approaching communes. People love Silvio Federici, who's obviously a great, brilliant, creative intellectual. but people love a certain autonomous attitude towards self-organization. And they love Rojava because it seems to embody autonomous ideals. And they love Zapatismo for the same reasons. But I think the Venezuelan approach to the commune is a different kettle of fish. I think it's much more close to the Chinese project. In fact, when the Chinese Project of the People's Commune, which was born in 1958 and survived until approximately 20 years, when Chavez launched the communal project here in 2009, he pulled out a book that was called Inside a People's Commune. And the Chiligang Commune. Chiligang Commune is one of the earliest people's communes in China. And I think it's an educational book, simply written, and it explains how the People's Commune of Chiligang worked. And I think a couple of important ideas there was that the commune was considered a superior form of organization. It was and it was huge. Just like the Chinese communes, the Venezuelan communes are huge. Many of them have 10,000 people. Some of them cover a territory that's as big as Manhattan. So the Chinese called the commune a superior form of organization, incorporated many cooperatives, it incorporated militia, and the same thing could be said for the Venezuelan commune. And the other thing that Chavez said in that very moment, he pointed out how in this booklet, they talked about a nationwide communal system and that Venezuela needed the same thing. So the communes were not conceived in this kind of radically autonomous way, but rather as part of a national system. And as we can see that being realized today, even with the process of consultation that Cira was talking about, or the attempts to form what they call salas de gobierno that connect the communes more directly with the direction. And so I think that that's the auspices under which the Venezuelan commune was born. And just to go back to Chavez, I guess I began talking about Bolivar and Chavez, and I think one of the important things that Chavez did and the Venezuelan people was to realize that revolutions shouldn't stay on the margins, can't stay on the margins of things. Chavez was where other people were not talking about taking power, he talked about taking power. Where other people thought of small organizations, he used the biggest organization in Venezuela, the Venezuelan military. He infiltrated the Venezuelan military and used it as an organizing force. And he immediately moved to take over the biggest resource in Venezuela, which is the oil resource. And I think he approached the commune in the same spirit. The commune was not going to be a small project, not going to be a simply autonomous undertaking, small is beautiful. No, it was going to be a national system. And he actually said, he did the calculation and speaking. He said, well, it took them approximately 15 years between the first commune in 1958 and the publishing of the book, which was 72, 73. And in 15 years, I hope we have the same national communal system here in Venezuela. So I guess it's 2025. Maybe his hope has been realized because there's 5,000 communes. They go to consultations in a trimestral manner, and they're being increasingly connected in this communal system.
Well, that was, I think, a really powerful and frankly inspiring note to end on. I know I've had you both here for more than an hour, and we could keep talking forever and ever. I feel like we're just scratching the surface of this really fascinating and important revolutionary process. But I'll let you both go. Before I do, however, I want to ask you about the question that I ask every guest who comes on this show, which is, who is an anti-colonial thinker, leader, or revolutionary from any point throughout history who inspires you and why? Chris, if you want to go first.
Oh, well, I want to say two. I won't limit myself to one. Obviously, everyone has many revolutionaries that inspire them. I'll start with Jose Marti. Jose Marti was a Cuban revolutionary in the second part of the 19th century. And I think the most impressive thing to me about him is the combination of cultural work with political organization. He was a great poet and dramatist. To some extent, I would say he invented many of the concepts we use today, like Nuestra America or America, a certain notion of the patria, a certain notion of the motherland. And he also was important in forging the notion of Bolivarianism. But at the same time, he was directly involved in political organization. He formed a party for the liberation of Cuba, and he believed in a single party system. And he carried out an armed struggle and actually died in an armed struggle. So I find Jose Marti to be an extremely inspiring figure for the present. I think the kind of nationalism or patriotism, which is not a chauvinist patriotism, not a closed in on itself patriotism, but a patriotism that reaches out to other peoples. Jose Marti wrote about Vietnam. Imagine someone in the 19th century having awareness that a national liberation struggle would take shape in Vietnam. He wrote of the people of Oman, what he called the Kingdom of Oman. So Jose Marti, I think this form of internationalism lives in Venezuela, especially in the bases. It has lived in Cuba, where the national patriotism is understood not as a chauvinistic, but as an inclusive thing, because it's inclusive, because it's a project that anyone can assume. And you can see that in the communes here, because the natural affinity people feel when a Palestinian comes, they immediately feel that they share the same project of national liberation. There's an immediate sense of sisterhood or brotherhood there. And then I want to mention Yahya Hassan, the leader of Hamas, who was assassinated approximately a year ago. I feel that he lived at the flashpoint where a certain kind of extremist imperialism, which is taken the shape of Zionism, is backed directly by US imperialism. He faced that extremist imperialism and developed a strategy that I believe that strategy will issue into the liberation of Palestine. Now, and I also want to point out that he carried out in a selfless way a struggle, and he died carrying it out, died standing, died fighting. I want to say something general about the way figures like this are used. The most important thing, the worst thing that can happen with these revolutionary figures is that they're separated from our reality. You know, that we can make a gallery, a pantheon that includes a host of revolutionary theories, but if they don't touch ground, if they're not useful, if they become merely nostalgic, it's completely useless. And so that way, in some way, I feel like people should celebrate the figures of their barrio, the people who've walked in their land, and they can actually translate into concrete struggles of the present. That's one reason I feel Yahya Sinwar is so important, because this is a struggle that's going on right now. Everyone understands that it's the center of an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial struggle. And I feel that Jose Marti, in our moment in Venezuela, Jose Marti, just read Nuestra America, his essay, and you can see the importance of defending the patria. You can see how terrible being a traitor is. You can see this form of patriotism that reaches out to other peoples of the world being alive here right now.
So I would say Lenin. Why Lenin? Well, actually, in the commune, as I said, I'm a popular educator in El Panal commune, and we are studying Lenin right now. As we study Lenin and as we study, his reflections on the party and the creation of the Soviets and so on, I think there's a lot that is very useful for us here in the global south. Obviously, Lenin was an anti-imperialist and an anti-colonial leader. So he would be one of the figures that I would have to pick up because of the space where we are in. Reading Lenin has become very important and very actually useful for us as communers to be thinking about to be reading Lenin. Also, his text on the state has been very important for us. And then yes, and actually, and I think what Chris says about thinking about the people in the like in your neighborhood, in your barrio, the people who are doing it, the people who those leaders that may not be well known internationally, but that are really extraordinary leaders. I would mention Ana Kaona, who's a comrade from my organization, from my commune. She is an extraordinarily hardworking person, but also a person with an extremely clear capacity to to open pathways to solve problems, but also to look at a bigger socialist horizon of building a commune. So those would be two leaders that would be important for me. One which everybody knows, and one which very few people know outside of the commune, but basically everybody in the commune knows, admires, and learns a lot from Ana Kaona. So those would be the two that I would mention.
Well, thank you both so much for those excellent answers and for really all of the incredible insights you've shared throughout this conversation. I'm just so grateful for the work you're doing, and again, especially to both of you for joining during this very turbulent moment. For the listeners, I will leave you today, as always, with some revolutionary wisdom from none other than Hugo Chavez. In September of 2011, 10 years after the 9/11 attacks and the beginning of the global war on terror, where the U.S. unleashes its own reign of terror on the peoples of the global south, Chavez addressed the UN General Assembly in New York, where he said, quote, "The empire has awarded itself the role of judge of the world without being granted this responsibility by anyone, and therefore imperialist war threatens us all. Washington knows that a multipolar world is already an irreversible reality. Its strategy consists of stopping, at any price, the sustained rise of a group of emerging countries by negotiating great interests with its partners and followers in order to guide multipolarity along the path the empire wants." Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. If you enjoyed this episode of Return to Bandung, please be sure to subscribe to the show and leave a review or a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please also follow us on social media. We're at Return to Bandung on Instagram and Twitter, and be sure to share this episode with anyone in your life who might enjoy listening. And of course, if you have any questions, feedback, ideas, or suggestions, please do get in touch at returntobandung@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you.